So just some housekeeping. We'd like all your microphones to be muted. And please type in your questions in the Q&A box so that we can have a dialogue with you, with our speakers. And I just want to tell you to please identify yourself. And we're very interested in identifying those who are researchers or those who would like to be researchers if you have an interest in research. So let us know in the Q&A box when you ask a question, or if you want to just put information about yourself in the chat, that would be fine. We have a post-webinar survey that will be emailed out, and there's also a QR code on the last slide that will have this survey. This is required for us for the continuing education to show that you increased your knowledge from our speakers today. And the recording of this session will be housed on our NHHF website, which is nhmafoundation.org, and it will be sent out to all the participants a week after the event. And I see that Dr. Burgos has joined us too, so that's great. Next slide. So we have our accreditation statement from a Medco. This just says that we get 1 hour, 1 credit for doctors, pharmacists, nurses, and anyone else that can claim the ACCME credits. Next slide. And the objectives really are to describe how physicians in private practice have developed successful clinical research with large panels of Hispanic patients that can improve healthcare quality in the United States. We'd like to review clinical research principles, in this case, how to write a successful proposal for sponsor or investigator-initiated proposals, and how to collect data, and how to write IRBs for patient safety. We'd also like to increase awareness about our National Hispanic Health Foundation, and especially what we're calling our National Center for Hispanic Health Research that will serve as a network for Hispanics and Hispanic serving physicians and residents to provide opportunities to advance your clinical research careers. And I'm getting, let's see, I'm getting a message on the chat. Somebody's asking about a copy of a transcript. Sheila Reynolds, I'm not sure who you are, but NHHF will have a copy. I did announce that earlier. We save the recording on our website, nhmafoundation.org, but I guess somebody else is recording. Next slide. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jose Burgos, Chief Medical Officer of the El Paso Medical Research Institute. Dr. Burgos, can you turn your camera on? We just want to be sure that we didn't see you earlier. There you are. So I'd like to welcome you. I'm Elena Rios, President of the National Hispanic Health Foundation. And as I mentioned earlier before you got on, that this is hosted by AMGEN, and we're very interested in increasing awareness of the all the research experience that you have and Dr. Martel has to share with our audience today. We're hoping to find new doctors and residents that would be interested in joining us with our network of researchers.
Most definitely. Thank you for the invitation.
Sure. Candace is handling the slides. Candace, and Dr. Burgos, just tell Candace to go next.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We can start. Well, the topic of the presentation is to discuss the safety on clinical trials. And this is actually a very important topic because at the beginning, if you don't have enough experience, you do not realize that any change that may occur on a patient, or any clinical change that you may find on a patient, is to be considered an adverse event. Let's say that a patient is actually on a placebo, this patient is not taking the experimental drug, and you happen to know because it's not a double-blind study, or because you happen to know who's taking what because of your role on the study, and you notice that there is an abnormality or a symptom, this is an adverse event. No matter what the cause is, that is the definition. So pretty much the adverse event is any unwanted or any new event that develops in a patient that is undergoing a clinical trial. So this event can be a symptom, it can be a sign, it can be an abnormal lab, it can also be an exacerbation of a chronic condition that they already have, and which might not even be related to the condition being treated with the experimental or investigational drug, but is happening at the moment that the patient is undergoing or is being exposed to this clinical trial. That is why it is important to understand that an adverse event is not necessarily related to the medication or investigational drug. We can see the next slide, please. As a definition, we can usually separate or classify adverse event in 4 different groups. The first one is when we deal with a symptom induced by, again, it could be happening just because it's an exacerbation of a chronic event, or it could be medication related. It could also be, or the second classification is when we see an abnormal lab. For example, there is an elevation in creatinine, elevation in LFTs, there is an electrolyte disturbance. So that is another type of adverse event. Psychological events are the third type of adverse events. And this can include symptoms that are not necessarily physical, but people who experience more depression, anxiety, that can be considered an adverse event of a study. And the last one is death, obviously the one that we never want to experience. But as you can see, also depending on the type of population that is being studied and the type of products that are being used, some events can be temporary, some events can be permanent. Now, some of these events might lead the patients or the subjects to be hospitalized. But in order to be considered an actual hospitalization, it has to be a third-level hospital, not a rehab facility, not a hospital facility, not a skilled nursing facility. Not every patient that experiences an adverse event will be stopped from the trial. We always have to follow up closely and determine if, based on what is happening, we need to change the strategy on what is being done for the patient, if we need to look at other medications that have absolutely no relationship with the investigational drug, in order to really make a decision on what is the next step, if the medication has to be stopped, if we need to see the patient closer, if we need to send the patient to a hospital, or if we need to do any other type of intervention, as obviously we are physicians monitoring the patient and we have to do a clinical assessment just like in any other setting. Obviously, being in a clinical trial makes this absolutely not different. Since we have an adverse event present in our trial, now we have to make the decision whether this adverse event it is related or unrelated. And this is an international nomenclature for this type of events. Related events is when we suspect that the finding is that these findings are related to the investigational drug, or they are not related. So obviously it takes sometimes more than one visit to understand the nature of the adverse event. Next slide, please. Answering this particular question, just to put this in perspective, when should you and your clinical research site collect adverse events And pretty much we start collecting this data as soon as the patient signs the informed consent. This is when the patient becomes officially enrolled into the trial. Anything that happens before that is not considered related to the clinical trial. Any adverse event that is reported after the informed consent, but before the study drug is administered, then it's considered a pre-treatment adverse event. So as you can see, just to make it extremely clear, adverse events are not necessarily related to the drugs that are being studied on a clinical trial. For how long are we supposed to follow up on adverse events? Well, it depends on what is causing it. Obviously, if it is part of a chronic condition, either related to the condition being treated on the trial, or if it is related to condition, the actual condition from the trial, then it will be different. Obviously, if you're dealing with a chronic condition, this is something that not only the site will be following until the end of the trial, but we also communicate with the patient's primary care physician to make them aware that there is something happening with the patient that is related to something different than the investigational drug or the condition that we are treating and following at the trial. If it is related to the investigational drug, or it is part of an exacerbation from the condition that we are following closely on the trial, then we have to follow until the patient is determined to be clinically and medically stable, okay? And then the study discontinuation, we pretty much, can we go back, please? Okay, thank you. If we discontinue the patient from participating in the study, then we have to make sure that that adverse event is specifically described as being part of the drug being administered, and that is the only reason for us to really get the patient off the medication or off the study completely. We can see the next one. Thank you. Now, regardless of adverse events being related or unrelated, they all have to be reported. And this is one of the most common issues that a site can go through. If you do not report this, then you're going to be dinged. This is considered usually a deviation, not necessarily a protocol deviation, but it's a deviation of communication. So your site is going to be cited for not reporting adverse event and for not properly following on the adverse events. So this is extremely important that nobody, no matter how mild we think an adverse event can be, and obviously understanding that it doesn't necessarily have to be related to either the diagnosis or the drugs being used, we have to make sure that it is reported. Okay, and the information that it's needed is obviously has to be backed up by medical history, all the concomitant medications, and I can read this twice. It's all concomitant medications, because if you have experience in patients in any setting, you will always remember that patients can easily forget medications that they are taking. They are easily prone to ignore over-the-counter medications as part of the regular medications. And mostly in Hispanic patients, we see that our neighbors are really good at prescribing and giving us and providing medications and dispensing them, mostly natural medications, and they rarely report this. So we have to ask very specific questions about infusions, any sort of teas or roots or anything natural that they are taking that hasn't been prescribed by a clinician, so we can really understand what is happening clinically around our patient. And obviously, if they have seen any other physician for any other condition and they are receiving treatment, we have to be on top of all this information, because it is very difficult sometimes to understand all adverse events until we discuss it with the patients, since our patients are usually they can have communication problems. So we have to address every little detail. Next slide. Okay. The principal considerations and reporting when we deal with institutional review boards, which are the IRBs, then we have to disclose the following things and the unanticipated adverse device effects. If there is a new risk or an increased risk related to any of the trial, either devices or medications, if there is any protocol deviation that actually harm the subject or place the subject at any risk of harm, and protocol deviations are far more common than we tend to think. And as principal investigators or sub-investigators, we have to work closely with our staff, with our clinical coordinator, so we can minimize and hopefully avoid completely any sort of deviation of protocols. Any little change can be considered a protocol deviation, and it could potentially be harmful for our patients. So any protocol deviation that has been made without prior IRB approval to eliminate an immediate hazard to a subject has to be reported. We have to report any audit, any inspection, or any inquiry done by any federal agency. We have to show and we have to demonstrate any written report by any of these agencies. And obviously, we have to report any allegation of non-compliancy or any findings of non-compliancy made to our sites. Very important, even though it's not necessarily an adverse event, but any breach of confidentiality. Remember that we are all in healthcare settings subject to the health information practice. So everybody has to follow HIPAA rules. We have to report any unsolved subject complaints. These are important, these are common, they can happen on a daily basis, and we have to report them, we have to write them up, and we have to report them as needed. We have to report any suspension or any premature termination by the sponsor, by the investigator, or by any institution. We also have to report if any of the subjects have been incarcerated and has not been approved to involve prisoners. Also, if there's any action against any of the physicians, researchers by the state medical board, very important to report. Any information where the sponsor requires prompt reporting to the IRB. A very important point, adverse event reporting requirements may vary across IRB. So we have to check with the IRB that we're typically using, if we're using more than one, to determine if our protocol determines what has to be reported or not. Next slide, please. Oh, okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Burgos. We'll have questions and answers after the next presentation. And we're only here till the top of the hour, 8 p.m. So now we have Dr. Joe Martell, Assistant Dean, Department of Graduate Medical Education at the California North State College of Medicine. And he is also in private practice and is going to focus more on the actual proposal writing, what goes into proposals, and his experience with his investigator-initiated trials. Dr. Martell.
Thank you so much, Elena. I appreciate the nice introduction. Let's go ahead and start because I've actually quite a bit. This is actually one of my favorite topics to cover because it really gets to the heart of what an investigator does and is. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. These are some of my disclosures. I have more, but these are some of the bigger ones that we've worked with. Next. What I'd like to do for an investigator-initiated clinical trials is go ahead and cover, first and foremost, the relationship that exists between a PI or primary investigator and the sponsors. What is an investigator-initiated clinical trial, what it means, what you can contribute as a potential ITT person, identifying a need which is at the heart of writing a proposal and then eventually getting down to the proposal and finally identifying the sponsors. And eventually, one of the programs that we're involved with in the HHF that hopefully will grow into something bigger. Okay, so next slide, please. So the relationship, it's important to appreciate that the relationship between sponsors and investigators is a partnership, obviously, to hopefully benefit patients and improve treatment and medications. The gold standard for all of these is the clinical trials. And so when you look at these, they're based on actual clinical trials. Okay, now the clinician is uniquely positioned because we are at the front lines. We are actually treating patients. And so we actually get to use the medications and we actually go ahead and can see what these side effects and adverse events are. Okay. Now, one thing that I would like to point out, and I'll show this a little bit down the line, is that one of the things to look for is that these adverse events that Dr. Burgos talked about don't necessarily have to be negative. They can actually be quite positive, and you should look both negative and positively at these events. Next. So what exactly is an investigator-initiated clinical trial? It is an independent study. In other words, you create the study and it's created by an independent investigator. So essentially, you are coming up with a clinical trial and you are going to be independent from the pharmaceutical companies, and you're primarily going to be asking them to support you financially and along with the expertise that they can provide. Now, you would ask yourself, well, why should they do that? There are obviously a lot of benefits both to the companies, to yourself, and not to your patients. First and foremost, it's an independent way of determining whether the medication is good or bad, whether you're going to get side effects. And believe it or not, pharmaceutical companies want to know if there are side effects under certain conditions, because everybody's best interest is served by making sure these products are used effectively and people are aware of what harm they can potentially cause. Now, they also are able to obtain real clinical world. Having done many, many clinical trials, I can tell you that by the time these pharmaceutical medications get out into the market, it's really a small group of people that have actually taken it, and sometimes the diversity is not even there. And then when these get out, you're finding all sorts of adverse events that you didn't even anticipate. So this is a benefit to the companies. And restricting or expanding the product's use is a very useful thing. And finally, you're able to generate new ideas that can benefit both you, the company, and of course the patient. Next. Now, again, what can you contribute? You have your expertise, your experience, your cultural and linguistic competence, your clear observation of novel ideas. If you're like us, you have your research staff and your facility that can contribute to these investigations. And of course, you have the diverse population, which is a really big one because in the past, minorities have clinically been underrepresented in clinical trials. Go to the next slide. You can see this is just, it's from 2011, but you can see that on the right-hand side in the first wheel, the actual population of the United States with the colored portions representing minorities. And then in clinical trials, you can see what a smaller portion we are. So, you know, it has been shown over and over that a lot of these medications will have different effects and different side effects based on racial and ethnical backgrounds. Next. So this is one of the reasons why pharmaceuticals want to contribute to improving diversity within the clinical trials. And again, everybody's interested in developing better medications that will serve a greater portion of the populations. Let me go through the steps that you would go through an independent, an investigator initiated trial. First and foremost, your observation and creativity is the heart of the study and will drive it, okay? Use, as you treat patients and you notice things that either are not going right or are working, where they shouldn't be, you can come up with a hypothesis and then develop a theory of how you would either prove or disprove it, okay? Then you go on to create a protocol. Initially, it can be just a rough protocol, but eventually this has to be refined. And usually is if when you find a sponsor, they have a medical liaison, and I encourage you to use these people because they're highly trained and they can be extremely helpful in terms of providing help for you, as well as eventually helping you write the full protocol. I then go on and I would recommend you do an internal feasibility study to determine if you have the type of patient population that you're going to be able to treat or test. And then you finally approach the sponsor to obtain funding, perform your study, and then analyze the results and see what you get. Okay, next. Identifying the need or possibly off-label use of a medication is an important thing, and clinicians are definitely uniquely in this position because on the hundreds and thousands of patients that we treat so many different medications, often things will come about that you didn't anticipate, whether they be positive or negative. And remember, a clinically an investigator-initiated clinical trial doesn't have to be for positive things. It can be if you're seeing something that looks harmful on the medication, you may want to go ahead and investigate that. And again, you prove or to figure out how you're going to prove or disprove it, and then put it on a paper and begin to look at it. Let me give you a quick example. When I was a medical student and into my residency, pilocarpine used to be a medication that was the main medication used to treat glaucoma. It's a muscarinic agent that causes constriction of the pupil in the musculature within the eye. The interesting thing, and even I remember seeing this even at the time, that when I gave this medication to a 20-year-old patient, lo and behold, they hated the medication and they complained that it blurred their vision. On second thought, when we used to give it to 50-year-old people, they used to tell me that they could read better, which is kind of an interesting thing. And I never put it together. Most recently, within the last year, these same medications have begun to be released so that older people in the 40s and 50s and 60s can now use these medications and they actually improve near vision. Now, obviously it was there for me to see and I didn't see it even though it was in eyes, but you can see it's these types of observations that can then lead on to the entire group of medications that will be used in the future. And this is just the beginning of what is going to be a very, very large field, which is using pilocarpine-like drugs to allow presbyopic patients to see and read better. Next. Okay, now developing a study protocol is a complex thing that almost certainly everybody needs help, because you really have to make it something that if legally challenged, you're going to be able to stand up to the muster. But I do encourage you to think of these things because you're going to find there's a lot of help to be found there. Again, the first place to begin with is a medical liaison of companies, because these professionals are there to actually look for these things and will assist you in a lot of different ways. Establishing your hypothesis and really look at this thing and develop an inclusion and exclusion criteria. In other words, if I was looking at pilocarpine, I probably would begin, with looking at patients between 20 and 25 and examining their vision, and then 40 to 50 and examining their vision to see if there was a difference. And then I would establish endpoints. In this case, it would just be reading at near. And the 20-year-olds would typically, well, I know they would show decrease in vision with a pilocarpine, and the people that are older would show an increase in near vision with a pilocarpine. Keep in mind that you want to take a look at the one symptom, one sign, which the FDA frequently uses to determine whether a medication will be approved for what you want it to be approved. Determine the order of administration, do your test, and then decide if you're going to have a control group or not. Okay, next. For feasibility, what I really enjoy, when electronic medical records came out, I can tell you I was one of those that really hated these things. And I still to some extent do, but there's some wonderful things about it. And part of it is that you can get an overview of your practice as a whole. So If I wanted to take a look at, how many 20-year-olds to 25-year-olds I had and who they were versus 50 and 40-year-olds, I could do this and actually go ahead and generate some really solid figures as to what I had access to in terms of patient populations and how I would go ahead and treat this. Frequently, you can take a look at what you treat most, okay? Then looking at demographics, you want to look at the racial background, you want to look at your diversity. These electronic medical records will make it a lot easier. You then want to go ahead and take a look at the equipment to make sure that you have the equipment that you're going to need. Then secure an area where you would store your medication so that you aren't dispensing medication that is bad, and also where you're going to house your medical records because you want to preserve them and you also want to save them for a while. Okay, next. Now, evaluating and approaching sponsors. In many ways, this is going to be one of the more challenging things because what you're going to be going is you actually want from these pharmaceutical companies their expertise and also the money that you're going to need to do this. Okay, these can be expensive trials, and based on how good your idea is and based on what you want to do, you want to try to come up with something that's also not just going to benefit the patients, but also something that is going to expand the way they use the medication. That pilocarpine example, if I were to approach a company that made pilocarpine for glaucoma, I would say to myself, well, how many glaucoma patients are there in the country versus how many 40, 50-year-old patients are there? Okay, so clearly, these are things that you want to point out to them because this is something that will make it economically profitable. And they want to invest this to try to also expand their medication and the use for it. So a good idea when you're approaching sponsors is go ahead and look for companies that clearly produce these products and have an interest in expanding the usage. Or if it's something that you're looking that's totally new, then you'll go ahead and approach companies that have similar products. If you can't find that, then innovative companies, and there are a number of them, it's very easy to go on their website and go ahead and take a look. And almost every company that you can look at that's major will have an investigator initiate a trial section, and they'll literally explain and talk to you and have a contact for how you contact them. So, and obviously you want to pick somebody that you're going to be able to work with you. You're looking for someone that wants to be your partner. And I think you'd find that companies are interested in what you have to offer. Next. Now, when you start your study, first and foremost, make sure that you get good clinical practice certified. I'm sure all of you are aware of this. This is just basically the standard of what you are required to work like in an environment of human research. These are wonderful courses. So if you haven't taken one of these, I would encourage you, even if it's just for your own interest, because it really teaches you a lot about the industry and how these clinical trials are conducted. NIH has these, they're totally free, and it's just a good thing to have to understand. You want to establish strict controls. Obviously, you want to do justice to your trial because you want to have it be based on scientific principles. And so the way you collect, preserve, and analyze your data is very important. And then afterwards, obviously analyze your data, consider a publication. Next. Now, the PI, or the principal investigator, which is you, especially if you initiate this trial, is above all, you protect the patient. The reason why you're doing these clinical trials is to try to improve the modalities of treatment and medication for your patient. So when you're going through this, if you see that the medication is causing any type of harm or has questionable effects, then you need to protect your patient. And all the adverse events, and certainly an SAE or a serious adverse event that Dr. Burgos described, fall right into this. So first and foremost, we protect the patient. Remember that as a PI, especially in your own clinical trial, you are responsible for everything. And that's good. And that's, something that I actually embrace, because not only does that give you control over it and responsibility for it, but that also gives you the ability to construct your clinical trial the way you feel it should be constructed. You decide who meets the inclusion and the exclusion criteria. You determine and evaluate adverse events. You determine if a patient needs to be withdrawn, and ultimately you determine the effectiveness of the medication or the treatment or whatever, if you're doing a device. Next. So now comes another one of my favorite topics, which I would like to, talk to you about. Obviously, the work that NHHF has done is remarkable, and they worked with us in the past really well. This is the Solo Kiko Advanced Clinical Research Program, which we're doing at the California North State College of Medicine. It's a program designed to train the next generation of diverse clinical investigators and improve diversity, not just in the investigators, but also in clinical trials. And finally, it's designed to help and make our diverse applicants to residencies and internships more competitive. Okay, next. Okay, again, the whole purpose of this program and its in evolution is to help develop the clinical research skills beginning the first 3 years of medical school. Why that? Because part of the philosophy of the Solo Kiko program is that we try to make these lifestyle changes earlier. I mean, it's almost like when you were in grade school and people told you, well, if you learn how to read in the first grade and the second grade, you're going to do much better in high school. And we believe that's the case also within clinical research programs. It's amazing that by the time medical students reach those first 2 years, they're really a pretty bright group of people, and you can teach them a lot more than I ever thought you could. Next. Let me tell you about the program that we did this past year. This is in 2023. It was developed as a advanced clinical research program for medical students that we hope will eventually be offered nationwide. We made the program a highly selective program, and that would teach all aspects of clinical research, including the investigator-initiated clinical trials. First of all, we began by teaching them how to identify, a project, an unmet need, something that needed to be analyzed. Now, in all fairness, at this level, you don't put them in an invasive situation, and that's part of what you pick. You pick subjects that are easily developed. Okay, then we developed together the protocol. We went and taught them how to do the IRB process. We performed a study, evaluated the data, and prepared a publishable paper. And now we've submitted it to the Journal of the National Hispanic Medical Association. So hopefully you'll take our paper. Next. Okay, let me tell you the first year. This is our first year results. This was sponsored by Genentech, and we would like to thank particularly Genentech for sponsoring this project, and especially Dr. Veronica Sandoval. It was an extremely successful project. We had 10 medical students, and surprisingly, I had to restrict this. I mean, I almost felt badly because I could have easily had 20 or 30 students. And so clearly, this is going to be a very popular, course. And then, as I say, we've submitted the publication. So I was very pleased with the way they developed. I mean, we really took essentially a raw group of medical students that had an interest in research. I ground them down. We developed, good skills, and we developed the concept that we were a team, in the sense, that nobody gets scolded for making a mistake, but they do if they don't correct it. And I was very pleased to see how far the students were able to be brought in terms of clinical trials. Next. So, what are our goals? Obviously, the goal of this is I would eventually like to see this program spread to a national program. In terms of being able to be offered, I think next year we're probably going to be offering this to at least 1 or 2 other medical schools. But I would like to see this go national because it has a number of really beneficial effects. The first and foremost, to promote cultural and clinical competence and sensitivity among all of the researchers that we work with. We are going to train a much more diverse research group of clinicians. In our group, we essentially, almost everyone was of a minority group. It will improve diversity, not only in clinical trials, but it will encourage future participation of a more diverse group of patients. And then what's really going to be, and what's going to make this a very popular program is that, number one, it will allow us to give these students the ability to be much more competitive when they've applied to competitive residencies, by first and foremost giving them this advanced clinical course. And we're working to be able to award grades and credits to the future participants. It will allow us to give them publications, which they'll be able to use in their applications. And then it will allow us to help them in terms of getting good letters of recommendation, which, you know, I tell the students, I write pretty darn good letters of recommendations, and you're going to get them from a dean. All you have to do is work hard and show me that you really are serious about this. And you know what? It works. We didn't have to push anybody. We didn't have to squeeze anybody. So I think that this is a way to go. We aren't going to get you your residence initially, but give these students 2 years and they're going to be residents. And I think that that's, you know, if we're successful, we'll be able to harvest another set of very good, diverse future research clinicians. So that's the goals that we're going into. Go ahead and next. And thank you. Thanks. I would like to thank Dr. Rios for giving me a really good topic. I really enjoyed talking about this. And obviously, if any of you have any questions or anything, we would love to answer them.
Yeah, we have a few questions. Let me go ahead and ask Dr. Burgos, you mentioned about reporting adverse events. You didn't mention who you report to. And someone did ask about reporting to FDA. But could you talk about who you actually report to? Are there specific forms for reporting adverse events?
Yes, there is an actual, each study will give you a different way to do it, but you have the first person to report to is to the sponsor.
Okay.
And they actually are the ones who will collect the data, and then they will report to the FDA. So fortunately, the site per se doesn't have to do reports directly to the FDA, but you have to report to the laboratory company that is actually hiring you to do the trial. So the sponsor is the entity where you report to.
Okay. And then just one clarification on IRBs. Could you tell us who does your IRB in El Paso, Texas? Is it a university? Is it a private company? These are some of the questions that have come up.
That is a good question. So IRBs, we have different type of IRBs. There are central IRBs, which is they are mostly private companies. They are all over the country, and they exist in order to obviously approve study, but they work solely for this purpose. The difference between a central IRB and an IRB from a university is that IRBs from universities, they actually meet from time to time. They sometimes even every 3 months. So in order to get your trial approved, you have to wait that long, and sometimes even longer than that. They are not necessarily, they will not assemble just to read your trial. You have to wait the time until they meet again in order to get this done. So in El Paso, for the most part, we use central IRBs. But there was an occasion where we had to do a trial with the county hospital. And even though the county hospital, it belongs to the county, it doesn't belong to a university, but all the medical services are tied to Texas Tech University. So for that particular trial, we had to go through the IRB based on Texas Tech. Like each university, they have their own IRBs and where they approve all the studies. They cannot use central IRBs. The advantage of doing this in an office, or in my case, that we have a center dedicated to clinical trials, is that we have the freedom to choose central IRBs. And actually, a lot of sponsors, they usually ask that question. That is one of the first questions to screen you, is whether you're going to use a central IRB or if you have a local IRB that will be used, because they know local IRBs, they will take longer to review and approve studies.
Good to know. Okay. Joe, or Dr. Martel, couple of questions about Latino patients. Both of you can answer this, but let me ask Joe first. First of all, you mentioned the benefits to the patient, you know, understanding that it's going to be good knowledge for our communities and add diversity to the clinical trial world. We need more Latinos patients. What are barriers to recruiting your patients into these trials, Latino patients? And also, one other thing, what do they get out of it? And is it true that patients do get access to free medications while they're on clinical trials? And also, the other question about the patients that we all see, undocumented, are they included in your groups? And does that depend on the sponsor, or can you do that? Can you offer a clinical trial participation to undocumented?
Yeah, this is unfortunately, the undocumented participants are a real problem, and technically, I can tell you, you aren't supposed to include them in. I find this a very, very bad policy. And I fight it in every possible way that I can, because I see that as discrimination against the patient that needs care. So we work around ways of trying to get past that. I know that some of the pharmaceuticals have been trying to get that portion removed, but it's not even that. I mean, when you do get Hispanic patients, you know, because we do have to overcome both linguistic and cultural barriers, are more reluctant to get on to these projects, and they don't really have a trust in the system. So this is something that clinicians that are Hispanic or, you know, culturally sensitive and competent can really, you know, benefit the patient, in the sense that you can improve diversity, because the patient, above all, the patient has to have comfort in your treatment, and the patient has to have comfort in your care. And if you come and tell the patient, okay, especially if it's in the early phases, like a conceptual or a phase 1, okay, this is something that I think might benefit you. And obviously, choosing the right patient for the right study is a big part of it, at least with us. And so they have to have the comfort in that patient doctor relationship. We find, you know, is very critical. And obviously, knowing the cultural connections along with the language really are beneficial. So yeah, I think Hispanic clinicians are uniquely positioned in a way that they can recruit these patients. And I think that that's something that, you know, I think pharmaceutical companies are beginning to recognize, and, you know, hopefully this will change.
Yeah.
I can
Dr.
add
Burgos,
something as well.
Sure.
Yes, obviously, living in El Paso is a border town, so we have Ciudad Juarez, it's our sister city. We do see patients from Mexico, and we do take care of undocumented patients. I know there are some sponsors who may have issues with that, but for the most part, as long as they have a valid identification, they can be enrolled. So for the most part, at least with my experience the last 8 years, I haven't encountered any issues, and we are able to enroll undocumented patients into trials, which is really advantageous, because El Paso has a population of about 1 million people. Then we have another city close to us, which is in New Mexico. It's called Las Cruces. Las Cruces have close to 100,000. But then when you talk about Ciudad Juarez, I mean, we're talking about 3 million people. So it's definitely, as long as they can cross the border legally, or if they're already, you know, passed and they're undocumented, they have access. But one of the limitations that I see is that if they are undocumented, they are most likely to avoid showing up into the clinic because they are afraid that they will be discriminated or that they will be called upon, the fact that they don't have any documents. Another barrier that we encounter, particularly with Hispanics, is the fact that at least I can talk about that because it's 90% of my patient population, is the fact that they feel like a guinea pig, and they will tell you in their own words. They feel like you're experimenting on them rather than trying to look for the benefit of certain medication for a condition. What I typically tell them is, we are all guinea pigs, since most medications, even if they are FDA approved, we are still seeing side effects, and that's when we see that all medications, they undergo clinical trials for the rest of time, because we might even find adverse events and effects that are not seen in the first few years of their use.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
it.
We're running out of time, but just a couple real fast questions. One is, somebody's asking about equipment. Joe, in your proposals for equipment, do you have to have equipment on site? Can you purchase equipment in your proposals?
That depends, and actually, that's a wonderful, one of the things that's kind of nice about it. For a good sponsor, what you don't have, they will typically provide. So we've had some very expensive equipment provided to us for the clinical trials by sponsors, sometimes over $100,000 for a piece of
Wow.
equipment. So they, if they have enough invested into the product, they will provide a lot for us. And so, I mean, we have a successful program that we've been using for, we've been out there for a long time. So yeah, I mean, don't be afraid to ask. If you don't have it, ask for it.
Okay, and Dr. Burgos, one last question. Post-pandemic, have you seen any change in the patients asking for clinical trials or doctors getting patients to come into clinical trials?
COVID did two things for the clinical trial world. The first thing is that it opened the discussion about the need to really investigate medication. So it did a huge favor. I think it impacted positively the spread of information and the ability to recruit. The only negative or the effect that I'm seeing in the post-COVID era is recruitment for vaccine trials. Actually, there are a few vaccine trials that I have received after COVID, and I'm actually not even trying to get them because we find resistance based on the negative media coverage that the whole vaccination process has received. But other than that, it actually did a tremendous favor to the clinical trial world because people are more aware of the need to continue with clinical trials, not only for coronavirus, but for other infectious diseases and other conditions. So it's actually
okay. Well, I want to thank both of you. This was a great presentation. This was our first of 4 webinars on clinical trial experience of Latino physicians who are principal investigators. We're going to have them quarterly from now until next February. And I want to thank both of you for being on this first one. We will have this recording on our website, nhmafoundation.org, in a week. And we will be sending it out to anybody that registered. We have a post-webinar survey. We would like you to submit it. We will be emailing that to you, and we'll show it on our screen right now, the QR code. And just to put a plug in for the National Hispanic Health Foundation, we have a big scholarship program. This year, we're going to give away almost 50 scholarships. 40 of them are going to be $20,000 scholarships, $5,000 a year, up to 4 years. If you're in school that long, you can only get it if you're a full-time medical student, dental, nursing, public health, PA, and pharmacy students. Our major sponsors, United Healthcare Foundation, for that. I want to thank them. But again, we're also looking for sponsors and donors to help us fly in students and their parents to our galas in Los Angeles and in New York City in November 17 for LA, November 30th in New York City. And then we will be giving out scholarships in Washington, DC, Chicago, and San Antonio for more regional So we cover the whole country. Next slide. We're also very interested in, here's our QR code to get the, let's see, sponsorship opportunities, mentorship questions, donations. And then the next QR code is our post-webinar survey. And we do need your answers for this. So please help us out with our grant from AMGEN. And my last thank you is to AMGEN and to our staff, Candace and Isaac, for helping us today. And again, want to thank our two doctors today, Dr. Martel from Sacramento, California area, and Dr. Burgos from El Paso, Texas. And as I mentioned earlier, we need to know if you're a doctor or nurse interested in clinical trials to join our research network. And if you're a resident, and I know, Joe, you put a plug in for medical students. Medical students are great to know, but right now what we're trying to do is develop a connection between residents who are in research and clinical trial doctors to see if we can't do some mentoring and help get our residents to increase their research time with doctors who are already doing clinical research and learn from them. And we can even do this virtually. So that's the whole point of these webinars, is to identify more Latino or Latino serving clinicians interested in clinical trial research. So with that, I think we made it on time. Thank you very much. And look forward to seeing you next time later on this summer. Thank you, for early September.